And now, part 2. What happened after 1980? This is what the debt picture looks like post-1980. Not so good. Even adjusting for inflation, debt has climbed steadily since 1981, with a brief respite in the late 1990s. The picture grew even darker during the last decade on into this one. Looking at annual spending as a percentage of GDP, a sharp increase in the 80s, followed by moderation and decline in the 1990s, and a sharp upward trend in the 2000s, spending was at 25% of GDP in 2009, the post-war record. The previous high was 23.5% in 1982. The cause for the surge starting in 2008? Partly the Great Recession, partly relatively anemic economic growth in the years leading up to the recession, partly automatic spending increases that kick in when the economy is in recession, partly choices Congress and the Bush and Obama administrations made on spending, the bulk of which were designed to lessen the recession severity, and partly a large drop in government revenues. In 2007, federal revenues were 18.5% of GDP. By 2009, revenues bottomed out at 15% of GDP. That's roughly $450 billion that disappeared from Uncle Sam's paycheck by 2009. Let's put it together. First, spending as a percent of GDP from 1950 through 1980. Add revenues for the same period. Notice how even with twists and turns of recessions and wars, spending and revenue stay reasonably close. Now let's add polynomial trend lines, a sort of moving average that smooths the highs and lows out. It's even clearer to see. The gap between the blue and the green lines gradually widens over the years. The economic growth took care of most of that. Now in chained dollars, still close. Add trend lines, we see the same patterns. The best situation in terms of actually reducing debt occurs when the green line, revenues, tops spending. This is the second best scenario. Spending was higher than revenues, the gap gradually grew wider, but economic growth more than made up the difference. Looking at 1981 through 2011 as a percentage of GDP, we see a very different pattern. The gap carried over from the late 1970s grew much wider and only started to close late in the 1980s. For 4 straight years, budget deficits hovered around 5% of GDP in the mid-part of the decade. In the 1990s, spending and revenues converged. Add trend lines, and it's even easier to see. In the late 90s, when the trend lines almost touch, the government recorded a budget surplus for 4 straight years between 1998 and 2001. The first time that happened since before the Great Depression. Looking at the same years in chained dollars, we see the same story. Add the trend lines, it's the same. The budget deficit bottomed out at minus 10.1% of GDP in 2009. It was down to minus 8.7% last year. Revenues picked up slightly, and spending moderated. Economists say that a nation can run deficits of 1 to 2% of GDP with no real harm, even 3% for short periods. Economic growth covers the difference. That's how we got into this mess. How to get out of it. First, return the economy to post-war growth patterns prior to 2001. Second, reverse the trend lines on the spending and revenues to move them in closer proximity and let the economy reduce the percentage of debt measured against GDP. Moderation and growing the economy is how the greatest generation did it. Actually reduce debt? The green line has to top the blue line. It's that simple and that hard. Oh, that was a lot to cover, and I had to fly through it pretty fast. If you want to study the charts at a more leisurely pace, they're available in this same section. Until next time.